Thank you all for joining us for today's Evaluating Journals for Publication workshop. Joining us today is Andrea Worth from the libraries. I'm going to just hand it over to her to get us started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me so early in the new year. Happy to be connecting with you all. Hope everybody is doing okay. So this is a workshop that the library, myself and another colleague have given a few times in the past, and we change it up a little bit each time. But I hope each time we improve it a little bit. So I will get going. It originated because there's been a lot of changes in publishing in the last couple of decades, and honestly, probably the last few decades before that as well. But one of the things that changed recently that has really impacted academic and scholarly authors for the last few decades is some different models of publishing that have been happening. And I'll share an agenda with you in a moment. But one of those big things was the ability to publish in an open access journal, which means that the work in the journal can be made freely available to anybody with an interest. The change was that prior to that, either in print or even in digital format, journals were kind of locked down to people with subscriptions, whether that was through their library or through a personal subscription or a membership with an organization or something like that. So it just sort of shook up journal publishing, and we get a lot of questions in the library, not necessarily just me or my colleague in my department, but liaison librarians and others, where we have folks coming to us from campus saying, you know, I've got this invitation for this journal I've never heard of. Help me understand what it is. Is it a good journal? That type of thing. How do I know if this is a good journal? And those questions would come from graduate students and faculty alike. So we thought it was time for a workshop. Like I said, we've changed it a little bit. I will say that while I'm going to give you some tips and talk about some things to look out for in journals of all models of publishing, so not just open access, but any type of journal. Librarians, generally speaking, aren't going to tell you where to publish. So if you do come to us and ask, is this journal okay to publish in? We're going to give you some tools and tips and resources and things to consider. We're probably not going to tell you, yes, publish in this journal, because that really is a decision for the author or their co-authors to make. So I hope this proves useful to you. And if you do have questions throughout, feel free, like Navina said, to pop them in the chat. We can take them as they come or closer to the end as well. So I hope that today you'll leave this workshop with these three things: a little bit better understanding of publishing terminology as it pertains to getting research articles or creative works articles published, the ability to discuss concepts of metrics and open access, again, both as they pertain to academic journals and publishing. And then I'll be sharing with you some tools and resources for evaluating journals. And in fact, we'll spend most of our time on that. So the agenda, first, we have a very short activity to start with. I will cover open access in a little bit more in depth than I just did, so that everybody's on the same page there, because it can be a little bit confusing if you're new to publishing or maybe experienced with publishing but haven't gone through an open access model before. Again, we'll spend time on evaluating journals, and if we have time, we'll do a practice evaluation, and we will have time for some discussion and questions, like I mentioned. So I'm going to give you maybe not quite the whole 5 minutes, because I'm not sure if folks need that long in this virtual environment where you have all of your computers, hopefully with another browser available. But I do want you to try to find, just real quickly, 1 or 2 journals in your area of study. We haven't covered anything about how to evaluate them, so that's okay. I would just land on a couple that look like they're related to your area of study, and keep those tabs open. So you're welcome to find that in any way that you feel comfortable. If you want to Google for them, totally fine. If you want to use the library's website, also fine. Or any other method. If you already know of a couple, I would just head on over to them and pop those windows open. We'll circle back to them a couple of times in the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do that. perhaps if you have them, I think I can see how many folks are in the session. If maybe when you do have a couple of journals open, you could let me know, and then I'll have an idea that we don't need more time. If you could pop that into the chat. Great. I'm seeing lots of yeses and ready to go, that type of thing. So thank you for doing that. I don't have any immediate questions for you on those, but like I said, we'll come back to them. And also they may be, as we dive into the tips for evaluating journal section, feel free to pop over to the journals you open to kind of just take in what's being presented alongside of the journals that you found. So with that, we'll move on. So like I mentioned, I do want to give just a brief introduction to open access because it is such a kind of important and important part of publishing these days, whether you choose to go that model or not. It's good to know what it is. So what is open access? It's peer-reviewed literature. This is boiling it down to the barest bones. Peer-reviewed literature that's both free to read and ideally free to reuse. Free to read means that no one anywhere is paying for a subscription to it. So what you probably see a lot of and hopefully use a lot of are for example, are our library subscription-based resources. While those are free to you in the sense that you're not paying for an article directly or paying for that journal subscription directly, the library is of course paying for those subscription-based journals. In an open access model, the library is not even paying for those journals, at least not in a way that supports any type of subscription just for their users. We may be supporting the model in some other way, but not through subscription funds. So that's the free to read piece. Anybody, anywhere. It could be a policymaker, it could be a person working or volunteering for a nonprofit, it could be a small business owner, it could be anyone, regardless of their affiliation with an academic institution that has access to the research. Free to reuse is kind of the ideal model of open access. So what that means is the work that you find is then given a very free license for you to download, distribute, and build upon. Not to plagiarize, not to steal, not to present as your own, of course, but to take and reuse and like I said, build upon. So you could take an article from over here that was open access and licensed as free to reuse, and another article from another journal and maybe put them together in a course pack or something and have no concerns that you're infringing on copyright. That's what open access allows. Traditional kind of subscription-based journals, generally speaking, don't allow for that model. I do want to reemphasize that it's peer-reviewed literature, though. If you do hear about problems with open access, which there have been some for sure, often it's around the issue of peer review, and we'll touch on peer review a little bit more later. So how do you publish in open access? Well, I just talked about the journal model, so there's that. I do want to just acknowledge, even though it's not the focus of this presentation, that there are actually other ways to make works open access. So there's online repositories or archives where even in the traditional model of publishing, where works are subscription-based and behind a paywall, there's often allowances by the publisher who owns the copyright to the work. They will often give the original author some allowances for sharing a version of that work in a repository. It's a little bit of a workload for the author. It's not seamless, but it is a model that folks use. And then I also just want to highlight that either of those models may be required by a funder, so NIH, NSF, different funders in this country, even private funders. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, requires their funded researchers to publish open access. And then there's a number of employers, often universities, that have some sort of policy that require their faculty authors to make their works open access, which typically those policies don't apply to graduate students. So just a heads up, but if you do hear about any open access policy, say at an institution you're applying to as a faculty member eventually, that might be what that refers to. I just want to give a shout out to this thing called the Directory of Open Access Journals. It is a place where you can go to find a list of peer-reviewed open access journals that have had some level of quality control. Not so much for the individual publication, but in order to get into the directory, journals have to go through a pretty lengthy, extensive application process. So this organization that manages the DOAJ has these guidelines where they will reject journals and publishers outright if they don't seem to be following set criteria. And I'm not going to go into those criteria, but I just wanted to let you know that if this appeals to you, this might be one place to start to find an open access journal. Again, this is only the subset of open access, not all of the subscription-based journals. So with that, hopefully everybody has a little bit of understanding of open access. We're going to spend the bulk of our time on evaluating journals. And so this kind of backs us up to really evaluating any journal that you're considering for publication, not just open access, subscription-based, any of them. So a couple of things that I'll start with. Is the journal a good match for your publishing goals? So you might not have thought about publishing as a goal other than maybe it's required for your graduation, or everybody publishes in the department, so you must too, or you're looking to move on either to a faculty position or research position, or if you're in a master's to a PhD. But hopefully it's also it's meeting whatever your goals are. Hopefully it's going to meet those. And then are there any concerns about the journal itself? And so taking a critical look at the journals you're thinking of. So first of all, what are your goals for publishing? And I'll just pause here. I mentioned maybe moving either on to another career or something, but are there what are the pieces of, what are you thinking about when you're thinking about publishing? What do you hope to get out of publishing in any particular journal? If anybody wants to pop any thoughts into the chat, that would be great before I share my ideas. I'll start with one. So currency, that's probably not a great word for it, but one thing that people are often really interested in when they're publishing is they want to have their work cited. And more recently, different types of attention on a scholarly work are being accepted and encouraged as well. It depends on who you talk to or kind of which maybe discipline you're in, how well received tweets and downloads are, but they are out there. So another one is, if you probably want to be sure your work ends up in a respectable venue. You don't want to accidentally publish somewhere where you wouldn't want to proudly display it on your CV or at a later point in time. Vetting by peers. Typically, we're after something that's peer reviewed. And I should say, these aren't necessarily in any order of priority or how things work. So you do, of course, I think most folks want their work to actually be discovered and used. So this has to do with, if you're familiar with research databases in your discipline, or maybe the general ones like Scopus and Web of Science, you probably hope that it ends up in those. And one thing that maybe people don't always think about is the preservation and permanence of your article for the long haul. So if you publish something this year, I think everybody would hope that it's still out there and available, 30 years from now and even longer. So the other piece of this was, beyond the goals for yourself, is kind of does the journal look okay, essentially? So I'm going to pretty quickly go through this because it's probably really familiar to most of you. We've all gone through a process at some point as an undergraduate, or maybe even before that. But we're always looking to see if the websites we're finding our information on look legitimate. There's so much information out there. We have to be critical thinkers basically anytime we're online. But I do want to use a website as an example for how we might move forward with looking at a journal as well. So some things that we can consider in the positive side of things, if a website looks good, would be that maybe it has a modern and current kind of look, technology, the content seems like somebody's keeping it up to date, it's well edited, not difficult to navigate. You can find what you need. Maybe you're after a particular piece of information. If it's an agency, maybe you're looking for reports and you know right where to go on the menu and look for those reports, or maybe you're looking for the owner of the website or the website. You can find it easy. And that it looks like a trustworthy source. So you're being able to determine whether this is a paid kind of for-profit thing or a nonprofit, government, institutional, that type of thing. But there's some things about websites that maybe not so great as well. So we've all gone to a website where something strange pops up, a video starts playing in the background. Maybe that report you wanted, that got advertised widely, and the implication was that it was free. Just head over here, come get it, and then you get there and you can read the first page, but not the rest. So maybe there's some hidden fees that weren't upfront. It's outdated. Just that you can tell that either the information isn't correct or simply the interface is not, doesn't have kind of a modern navigational look to it. And then, of course, if you do get to the content you need and it's not great editing, outlandish headlines, things to just draw you in, maybe for the ad revenue or something, but again, the content isn't good quality. And in some cases, you'll end up on websites where maybe somebody's impersonating kind of indirectly another resource that you're actually trying to get to, and you landed on a website that's not the one you intended. So considering all those things, there's very similar concepts you can use to consider your journal, and maybe not in such kind of minutia or detail as that. But along those lines, we've developed this author's checklist for evaluating journals, and somewhere I have a link to that that I will share later. So these, again, are just things to consider. They're a little bit similar to what I just covered for a website, so hopefully that gives you comfort and that you already know how to evaluate a website. So a lot of this will translate over to how to evaluate a journal. There's also a resource on the left side of the screen called Think, Check, Submit. If you follow that URL, and I will share my slides later, you get to a short video that covers a lot of this in a very short format. It's kind of interesting to watch. But I do want to go through some of those things on that checklist first. So again, think of this again, how you might be looking at a website, except now you're looking at information about a journal. So the first one I wanted to cover was first impressions. This is actually a call for paper, so this is not a screenshot from a journal. It's an email that I received a while back. This wasn't a great first impression they gave me. It was a unique situation. I don't get too many like this. It was worth capturing for sure. One is that they seem to really be trying to wow me with some metrics, and we're going to spend some time on metrics, a slide or two on metrics in a little bit, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but if this is what they're trying to tell me about, I want to verify the impact factor, or find out maybe what global impact factor is. Like, what does that mean? They seem really excited about it, but I want to know that that means meaningful to me. The other thing having to do with first impressions on this particular one is that it's a call for papers. And while that's fine, journals of all makes and models do calls for papers, special issues, new journals will be trying to drum up business. That's can be very annoying, but it's how the world works with the unsolicited emails these days. What was strange about this one is there were about 1,000 people that this was sent to, and we weren't BCC'd, or it wasn't like using MailChimp or something like that. It was like a kind of a direct email, which I guess some people might consider great, but it was like everybody whose name starts with A, me included, and 1,000 people that I have no idea who they were from other, like I could have replied all to every single person on this list, and it just seemed maybe that it wasn't being handled super professionally. So and then it's also an engineering journal, and I'm a librarian, so all sorts of things there that struck me as odd in my first impression. I'll go through this one pretty quickly, but this is the homepage for a journal. It's changed a little bit since, but it's just looks a little bit out of date. I captured the screenshot a couple of years ago, and I don't know if you can see down at the bottom, but the copyright is 2014, and it is now updated to 2020, I think it says. on the live page, but it took them a while to make those updates. So there's just some things that there's a lot of color and a lot of links, but what do they all mean? I'd want to dive into this if I were considering this journal. So I mentioned peer review earlier. If you get to a journal that you're thinking about, there's several reasons you'd want to consider peer review. One is hopefully a journal will tell you how long peer review takes. That could be for a couple of reasons. It could be at the extreme end, they might be communicating to you that we're a really popular journal, get a lot of things. If your article makes it to peer review, it's going to take us 8 months to get through that. So communicating kind of the average time to you would be helpful. That might be an extreme and you're thinking, I'm a graduate student, I need to get something published more quickly. This looks like a great journal. I can't wait 8 months. So there might be that end of the extreme. The other end of the extreme, which is a little more common as far as probably an outright concern about the quality of the journal, is if they're advertising a really fast turnaround on peer review. And this is where this reality check kind of comes in. This is also on that author's checklist for evaluating journals. So if you vet, first of all, when you submit an article, it's likely to get vetted by the editor first. They're probably not just going to pass it straight along to reviewers without some level of determining that the subject matter is at least okay for the journal. Then they have to recruit reviewers, and some of them are going to say no, they're not going to have time, they're doing too many reviews either for that journal or another, and they're just not going to be able to. So it'll take a little bit to get the 2 or 3 reviewers that they need in most cases. When those reviews come back, the editor is going to need to kind of synthesize what all the reviewers said. And it may not be the editor, it may be an editorial assistant or somebody like that, but somebody somewhere is going to have to communicate the results of the review to you in a comprehensive way that gives you some guidance. Is this rejected, but you could make major changes and submit it again later? Is it going to be, we really love this, you need to make some minor tweaks and explain these sections, but if you do that well, you're good to go and we'll publish it, that type of thing. And then there's, of course, some different models of peer review out there, whether it's blind, double blind, where nobody knows who anybody else is, and there's even open peer review where everybody knows who everybody else is, whether you're the author or the reviewer. But the point is that good review really takes some time. So while 8 months to go through a review, or a year, or whatever some of the more popular journals might need, might be an extreme, hopefully there's a match there and the journal communicates that clearly to you. So at this point, I'd like to pause myself and just ask you to head over to one of those journals you found earlier and take a look and see if you can find what the journal says about peer review. Is it blind, double blind? Do they may or may not give you a time frame for how long it takes. If they do advertise a very quick turnaround, I'd be interested to know that as well. So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes for that. So take a look at one of your journals, see if you can navigate to the information about peer review. It may be in the information for authors, maybe in an about section, might be hiding somewhere else. And maybe if you could just pop into the chat if you are able to find that, if peer review, like just the amount of time, if they do, either the time it takes if they say that, or the type of review they do, blind, double blind, open. I see one person has a double blind review journal. Is anybody else finding anything on the kind of the peer review policy or information in their journal? Thank you. Public health. Okay. 2 reviewers. I usually see 3, but in some disciplines, yeah, definitely different, or journals just different. Excellent. Okay. Well, we'll move on for the sake of time, but thank you both for sharing what you found there. And I will just say, if 2 minutes is probably not enough time for some of the journals, legitimately, for you to be able to find that information. But if you were, yeah, someone comments they're not sure where to find it. If they did spend probably a little more time on it and still didn't come up with information about kind of peer review on that journal, it would probably be worth asking somebody else about, getting a second set of eyeballs on it, or perhaps raising a red flag that if the journal's not being upfront about peer review, because you would want to know, even if you don't care whether it's blind, double blind, or if it takes 2 weeks or 10 months, you would want to have that information ahead of time. Okay, so let's move on. So another piece is that, would you cite the articles published? And I feel like this is one of the really good kind of checks for people. And this has come up a lot in some of those conversations. I make it sound like those conversations happen all the time. They don't. I've had a handful of conversations with people about journals. They're wondering if they're legitimate or not. But one thing that comes to mind is they get, kind of like I had in that first example, you get a solicitation for a journal. So people will find out about your research. You'll be presenting. Maybe you'll write one article, and a publisher will find out and offer you, reach out to you to potentially publish your next article with them. But if you've never cited this journal and you've never heard of it, it could be that, on the happy side of things, you're learning, oh, this journal is really new. It's really relevant, whether I publish here or not. Now it's in my suite of things I'm going to use as I continue to do my research. On the other hand, you might realize that if you go and you look at the journal, maybe either the content just isn't relevant to your field. And so it was like that one example I showed where it was an engineering journal. I'm a librarian. That doesn't make any sense for me to really even entertain it beyond that. Or perhaps they're just, if you could look at the content in the journal, even if the topic is a good match, you find that the articles aren't well edited. Perhaps you go back to peer review and it looks like maybe their peer review isn't so great. Some different concerns there. So I often recommend, if you're considering a journal that's just kind of come to you out of the blue, if you're not already citing it, sort of question why you're not citing it. And there's just some tips on the screen that have to do with, like I mentioned, whether it's copy edited or well, or if the references look right. Just looking like somewhere where you would want to have your article displayed. Another thing, this is where my librarian hat really comes on, is we do, the library provides and routes people to a lot of academic indexes. If you're in engineering, IEEE has its own index. Sorry, not an engineering librarian, but there's there's ones for geology, for public health, for literature. All of the different disciplines have indexes and databases that you use to discover and build upon. So when a journal, such as the one on the screen here, lists indexes, what I'm looking for is, are these indexes that I am familiar with? Do I use them if I have access to them? What do they mean? Kind of just, this was a bit of a red flag for me on this journal. This is a bit old of a screenshot, so it may not be accurate anymore, but some of you have probably heard of and used the EBSCO suite of databases. Well, right up towards the top, there's a misspelling of the EBSCO databases, so that would be a concern to me. And then the purple arrows are pointing to indexing in various library catalogs. And while there's always an exception to the general rule, most university libraries are not indexing journals. We provide access, like I mentioned, through subscriptions, but we don't actually act as an indexer of academic literature. Again, there's always an exception, but for the most part, that's not the case. So that was another aspect of this one that sort of gave me pause. So I think for you, if you're on those I'm not going to pause this here to do this, but if you were looking at the journals seriously that you searched for a little while ago, check to see if the databases you're using to find sources for your lit reviews and that type of thing, is that where that journal is being indexed, and use that information for what it's worth to you. Okay, this one is not something a lot of people think about, but it goes back to that kind of open access piece. If you do want to have some control over how your work is shared, and really anybody, even if you aren't particularly worried about that, you'll want to read your author agreement before you sign it. And so this will come from any publisher. You'll either be asked to transfer copyright outright. Most likely you'll be given some rights back to your own work. There's also where you maintain copyright, and you're either giving the publisher an exclusive right for first publication or a non-exclusive right where you could share it in multiple venues. So just, it depends on what you as an author want, but just do be aware that journals may very well, in order for you to publish, claim copyright. Well, not claim copyright, but ask you to transfer copyright to your article, to them. So a couple of things about open access, and this is about at the bottom of that article, or excuse me, author's checklist for evaluating journals. I know you don't have that at your fingertips, but when you have it later, you'll see this. It does cost authors money to publish in some open access journals. So similarly to peer review, you'll want to have this information be very clear. The journals typically are very good about telling you that they're open access journals. What could be problematic is if they're not clearly stating whether they charge fees, and if so, how much it is. Hidden fees are never ever good. So we've had authors at UNLV happily pay, I think we did have someone that I'm aware of pay $5,000 to publish in a very prestigious open access journal, and they were happy to do it. And the library has a fund that helps support these, so they got a little bit of a subsidy from the library, but it was only to cover part of the cost. And so it's okay as long as you know the journal's good and the journal is doing what they say they are supposed to be doing in order to support themselves. The reason this is a legitimate model for publishing, again, as long as the services are being provided, is because the journals really do good work. They need to be able to pay an editor, pay for their web hosting, pay for the archiving services, pay for the minting of DOIs, pay for that kind of cross-linking between references, editorial work, all of the things. They need to be able to pay for it in some way, and open access journals aren't getting subscription revenue, so they're getting it from somewhere else. But again, it really needs to be super clear on their website if they're going to charge you. We've had other instances in UNLV and all over, but I'm familiar with a couple at UNLV where an author did respond to an invitation to publish an article in a suspect journal, didn't realize it was suspect, and then had their article held hostage before they realized they were going to need to pay something. And so there's very little they could do because they'd clicked through, they'd submitted. Now the journal's saying, we're owning your article, but we're not going to publish it until you pay. And it's just a really unfortunate circumstance. So just be aware of those. But again, on the flip side, there can be some really expensive processing costs, article processing charge costs for completely legitimate journals. Just to give an idea, been going back to peer review and some other, usually peer review, but some other things that happen as we see retractions happening. So retractions mean a couple of things. One is that somehow somebody's poor research got published without, either accidentally or through carelessness, without good peer review. And it can be really costly. So just reiterating kind of the importance of whether you're paying as an author for publishing or it's a subscription-based journal, doesn't matter. You want that peer review piece, and the rest of the organization, the publisher that's operating the journal, to be acting diligently and good. That doesn't mean that honest mistakes don't happen in peer review. It's just that it's important, and there's this whole blog dedicated to retractions. So that's one piece. So the retraction can mean that something bad happened and it was just a little nefarious and editors or reviewers weren't really doing their job. The other piece is that it's actually good when a journal does retract bad literature. I mean, it's unfortunate for them. They get a lot of bad press. People are unhappy. Of course, the authors are unhappy. The institutions that the authors are affiliated with are unhappy, but at least the journal is doing right by retracting it. There are, of course, some journals out there that maybe one of their issues is they'll refuse to retract something even if it's proven poor research. So just one more example of how the journal business can be a little strange sometimes. This was from a few years ago, almost 5 years ago now. But the Federal Trade Commission here in the U.S. Charged an academic publisher, Omics, with basically that they were making false claims and defrauding researchers who were paying publishing fees and not getting the service that they provided. And so this actually ended with a $50 million fine to this publisher. And I believe this publisher has since gone out of business, and they were not only publishing articles, but hosting conferences as well and claiming to be very prestigious when they really were just taking people's money and not doing any of the work. So these are extreme cases, but it is worth your time to get your articles now and in the future into prestigious, good, solid journals. So I did want to spend a little bit of time on metrics, which is also on that list. Metrics, and when they refer to journals, are often, well, one metric when we're talking about journals that often comes up is something called the impact factor. So again, I'm just going to pause for a minute here. Hopefully that journal you were looking at a few minutes ago is still in another window, and you can quickly head over there and see if there's an impact factor or any other kind of numerical value displaying on maybe the home page of the journal. It's usually where it is. I'll give you just a minute or two for that. And then let me know if you found an impact factor or something else in the chat. Is anybody having any luck seeing something numerical that journal is advertising about 5.4? Jamie, can you let us know what discipline or journal you're looking at? MIS quarterly. Okay. Get back to H5 index. H5. Okay. Cool. The A journals in my field. Excellent. Sounds like that's a great example of how different journals will advertise different things that do not cross over. Another one that's around 5. Okay. Fantastic. So one thing I will say, if anybody else is on a journal and they're either not seeing an impact factor or they're seeing an impact factor that's like 0.75 or something, don't take that to mean that 0.75 is terrible and 5 is wonderful. There's quite a range, and even more importantly, there is quite a difference between different disciplines. So even in different areas of science, you will see massive differences, maybe in health sciences versus, say, geology or something like that. So really you would want to, if you were going to worry about impact factor, you would want to be kind of looking at the world of journals that would be in your discipline and not comparing. If you're in literature, don't try to compare yourself to a biomedical journal. It's not going to be useful. So thank you for sharing those. We will talk about what impact factor is in just a moment. So it's based on citations. And it usually has to do with the number of articles published in recent years. Impact factor itself is based, I believe, on the last 2 years. And I think one of the chats popped up with an H5 index. So there are also based on citations, but through a broader range of years. I believe H5 index covers 5 years worth of publishing. So it's basically the citations against the number of articles published to get some type of an average. And I'm really simplifying that. Each of those calculations has their nuances. but just know that mostly it's based on citations over some amount of time and number of publications. So some of you may have seen on the screen a colorful mark, a donut, I like to call it. This is covering altmetrics. This gets back at the one of the things I mentioned just in passing early on, where downloads and tweets and other types of things, mentions in the news. So if the New York Times covers your publication, that gets captured in these alternative metrics. There's a couple of different models of those. So you might see something called PlumX. You might see the altmetrics donut, different things. And these are helpful if that is of interest to you. Not every scholar believes in the value of altmetrics. I think most people like to see their stuff talked about on social media and stuff, but perhaps it's good in one way to know your article is getting some attention, but it might be a little bit less value than it will in many cases be of less value than a citation if, say, you're going up for tenure. But regardless, they're out there. A lot of journals will probably display their metrics. So just know what those means, and if you're either looking up your own article that's eventually published, you can follow the links in those altmetrics and PlumX metrics to kind of see what social media or news outlets are talking about your work. And if you're looking at a journal similarly, you can see who's talking about their publications. So 3 journal metrics. I'm not really going to cover these in great detail, but usually it's what you just saw on your journal homepages. They list a number. It'll be completely out of context unless they provided some context. There are different sources for metrics. So the one at the top here is a screenshot from the journal citation reports, which is the authoritative source for impact factor. There's also something called the eigenfactor, which I'm not going to cover, but it's a completely different metric, also based on citations. And then another one that's Simago Journal Reports, I think is what the R stands for. They're all just using the citation and time frame a little bit differently to come up with different numbers. You'll often see patterns where, like, you'll notice at the top screenshot and the bottom screenshot, those are the exact same journal. At the time these screenshots were taken, they were both at the top of the scoring for each of those resources. So one was at the top of Journal Citation Reports impact factor, and the other one was at the top of the SJR. So that is not uncommon. So you probably will hear again about impact factor the most, more than eigenfactor or the SJR score. And a lot of people love it, and a lot of people don't think it's very valuable because it's an average. It doesn't mean your article is going to get cited that much, or your article could get cited way more in a low impact journal. You might be the one bringing up the average. So it can go either way, and really it speaks to the journal overall and not so much to the individual articles within. But if someone does refer, I saw a comment. I'm going to finish my one thought, but then I'm going to go back to Navina's comment. I'm going to, the Journal Citation Reports is itself a subscription resource, and the library has access to it. So if you are told, maybe a co-author or an advisor or somebody says, well, what are the high impact factor journals in our field or your field, or what is the impact factor of that journal you're considering, you can head over to Journal Citation Reports and look it up. If the journal is not in JCR, Journal Citation Reports, that's okay. There are a lot of reasons why it's not in there. Perhaps they don't want to be, because there are, like I mentioned, that not everybody thinks the impact factor is a worthwhile metric to rely on. But more likely it's a newer journal. It may just be that it's difficult for the resource that produces JCR to index. So if they can't kind of pull in all the data and get their citation information from the journal easily, they may not be able to index it. But what I wouldn't do, unless you're already pretty confident about the journal you're looking at, is entirely trust the journal's homepage, because they will do something like this journal. So I'm using Omics. This was the publisher that got sued and is probably no longer really in existence at this point in time. They had this on their that I just took a snapshot from physics for no particular reason. They had this thing called journal impact factor, and they showed this calculation. I looked up these journals at the time the screenshot was taken, and none of them were either in JCR, which again is the authoritative source, or if they were, and I really don't think any of them were, the value of the impact factor was quite different. So I just wouldn't take initially the journal's word for it. Let me head over to chat for a second. Oh, what numbers you should consider. I'm not entirely sure if I completely understand the question, but if I understand correctly, if you mean like a range. So again, it's helpful if you head over to the Journal Citation Reports database, and I'm not going to demonstrate that today because it would probably be almost a whole session in itself. But you can, once you get in there, you can look at disciplines, and you can even look at several disciplines. So say you want to look at all of engineering versus a subset of engineering or something like that. You can do that, and then you will get a list of all of the journals, and you will see the range. And I think that would be more valuable than trying to see what the range is throughout the entire database, because you'll get everything from a humanities journal, which just by the nature of how scholarship works in humanities and article publishing, which isn't the most common form of publishing, typically are going to have way less citations and a lower impact factor than a biomedical journal that's cited like crazy because that's the standard in the discipline or something. So the numbers you should consider are really contextual in terms of what your discipline is, and the same would go with H-index. It just kind of depends on your discipline. Hopefully that answers that, but let me know if not. Oop. So I was going to if you could head on over to your journal again. I think I accidentally hid my screen that had the steps on this, but I think that's okay because it's pretty straightforward. I would choose one of the things we just talked about. And that realized that was kind of a lot to cover. So whether we already did peer review, but maybe you could take a quick peek at the indexes, or if you weren't able to find the impact factor, I know some of you were successful, take another look for that. Trying to think of what else. Any of the other things we talked about, if it's an open access journal, what the fee is, or even if it tells you if there's an open access publishing option, perhaps. Take a couple of minutes and see if you can find something that was on the things we covered. I'm going to do, and while you're doing that, I'm going to bring up a resource list. Okay, I changed my screen a whole bunch just then, so hopefully you still see the practice slide. In the chat, I'm also going to put the link to, there's two resources in that Google Drive that everybody should be able to view. One is the author's checklist for evaluating journals, which I showed on the screen at the beginning. And the other one is a list of resources that talks about how to get to journal citation reports, for example, since we're not doing a deep dive into that. Anybody like to share what they saw in their journal? Any Anybody come up with an open access journal or see any index lists that look promising or not so promising? I see another person put in an impact factor. Thank you. All right. So these resources are outlined in the other handout. So not the article author checklist for evaluating journals, but other things. And I think there's a few other things on that as well. So mostly I just wanted to give you a way to find impact factor, how to look for databases in your discipline if you weren't already familiar with them, and some other things I had mentioned previously. Oops. Sorry, excuse the extra slide here. Skip that. So I think I will, since we do have a little couple of minutes, I think I will have you go out to one of the metrics sources, and the two on the bottom, probably a little easier to get to. And see if you can find either of the journals that you have. So here's and see if you can find either of your journals in there. If you want to go to journal citation reports, happy to have you do that. It will just, if you're not already on the university network, you would log in with your ACE account just like you would for other services at UNLV, and it would just take a little bit and a little bit less direct of a route to get there. Maybe just a minute more for that. Hopefully they're fairly easy to search. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So someone is asking about their journal on eigenfactor, and it says 98 for eigenfactor score and 95 for AI. So I'm probably not going to be able to answer that satisfactorily. The article index is a way of trying to quantify the impact of individual articles with a little more precision than something that's broader for the journal, but I don't remember how their metrics work exactly. So I can't answer the details on that. And for as far as the eigenfactor goes at 98, it's probably coming up in a subject category. And so if you're able to back out or see the broader list of where the journal appears, it might even appear in multiple subject categories, and you click on that, and if you see 98's near the top or the middle or the bottom, you'll have an idea of where it's ranking. But that's a great question. So that goes to speaking about if you hear somebody rattling off that they've published in a journal with an impact factor of 10, that might sound great compared to some of the numbers that we've seen but maybe they're in biomedicine and the average impact factor is quite a bit higher. And I would always caution that impact factor shouldn't be everything for you. And again, just like was asked in the chat, the know what it is that you're looking at. All right. So I don't know if there were any. That was pretty. Oh, categories medicine. Okay, so very broad. Oh, so where do you know where it? I'm probably going to mispronounce your name. Axenia. Do you know like where 98 sat in that broader category?
I thought I would just unmute to make it a little easier to answer the question. I'm not
Thanks.
entirely sure. Also, you didn't pronounce my name wrong, so thank you.
Oh, sure.
Um, but I'm not entirely sure how to figure out exactly what it means. So I clicked on the journal and I expanded into two graphs at the bottom. So it, I'm not sure where to see in the percentile, it's showing that 98 is almost all the way full. So I'm assuming it's a higher indexing, but I'm not quite sure. And I think the graphs below are just showing the uh, change in the numbers over time by each year.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm a little rusty on the eigenfactor because we get asked so much more about impact factor. But yes, if it would be probably useful to you if you're considering this journal to also go look it up in journal citation reports and just kind of see if they're, um, placed similarly. Um, yeah, yeah. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I can't
thank
answer
you.
that.
No, this is cool. I looked it up on both, so I think it's cool to compare them. Thank you.
Excellent. Sure, you bet. And with that, we are pretty much at time. If there's any last question that somebody wants to ask, and well, anybody's thinking about that. Not seeing any other chats come in. I just did want to give a shout out to my colleagues. You can always reach out to me. I spend a lot of time thinking about open access and publishing models and how much libraries and authors pay for various journals. So that's kind of my area of expertise. Christina Miskey, who just started with us last year, is awesome. And her area of expertise is metrics, one of her areas of expertise. She has several. So if you really do want to dive deep into eigenfactor, the SJR score, impact factor, any of those things, I recommend Christina as kind of a point of contact for that. And then always, hopefully, everybody has become aware that you, for each college, sometimes with several within each college, depending on the college, you have a liaison librarian for your discipline. And so to find that person, go to the library homepage and choose meet with a librarian. You get a big long list of people, just search for your department or discipline there, and you will find that person and they can help you with all kinds of things, including the content I talked about, as well as other things.
Thank you so much for this presentation. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for attending, everyone.
Have a great day. Thanks.